This lecture will cover Chapter 1, which your book titles Learning to Change. I choose to kind of conceptualize Chapter 1 as the beginnings of learning. And what you'll notice as we go through this chapter is that we seem to start in a very strange place to understand learning, the process of learning, and the psychology behind it. But what we'll discuss is that a lot of how learning occurs, especially early on in the development of someone's life, has a lot to do with the way learning occurs in the natural world. This first video will start with how the study of learning and learning itself got started. Video 2 will then cover some of the building blocks of learning. That term building blocks will make more sense later on, but essentially refers to the ways in which we learn starting at the beginning of our life. Before we get into the content, I want you to take a second and think for a second about yourself 1 year ago. Think about 2 or 3 things that have changed about you since a year ago today. Then I want you to think about your community a couple of years ago, whatever that community may be. It can be Cameron, it can be where you live, it can be your state, your country, so on and so forth. Think about 2 things that have changed since that point. And then think about the world as a whole, 5 years ago, today. Think about 2 things that have changed about the world. What you'll notice is that there is a constancy of change. Just as my brother-in-law here was once a cute, adorable 6-year-old, he is now a 15-year-old teenager. That same consistency and constancy of change happens to every aspect of our psychology. And that's essentially what learning is. Learning is anything that prompts a change in something that's observable, like behavior. Change is, in fact, the only constant thing we have. Pardon my cursor, it's acting a little strange right now. Throughout our lives, we change. Everything changes. That is one of the only constants we can expect out of the world. In fact, any individual or species must be able to cope and change in order to survive. And for that reason, we actually start the study of learning by looking at how change occurs in the natural world. Charles Darwin was actually the first scientist to investigate this. He focused on the natural history of species, how species have changed over time, how they've learned. And he founded, obviously, the theory of evolution, which was his attempt to explain this process. This theory is based off the idea of survival of the fittest, which many of you might already be familiar with. Essentially, survival of the fittest means that the individual within a species that is best able to handle with, cope with their environment will be the one that goes on to survive. And when that happens, they pass on those traits that help them survive to future generations and offspring. Survivors will have favorable characteristics, meaning characteristics that happen to work well in their environment. Because those characteristics worked well, allowed this individual to survive, they were passed on to future generations. That's survival of the fittest. In the wild, nature actually determines change. That's why it's called natural selection. The processes of the natural world determine change in a species. Again, this is over generations. Variation among species leads to long-term change. You have one member of a species who has characteristics that are different or vary from another one. That variation is going to determine which genetic information is passed on. I want to point out that, or here's an example, appearance of complex organs doesn't just occur suddenly. Think about the brain of a jellyfish. Your book goes into a little bit more detail about this, but over millions of years, the brain of a jellyfish evolved specifically or changed specifically to cope with its environment. I want to point out that natural selection, the theory of natural selection, doesn't mean that species are going to turn out perfect. It doesn't lead to perfection. In fact, sometimes natural selection can lead to very strange, unnecessary things like humans having a tailbone. It takes countless generations, millions of years, for this type of change to occur. And it's prompted by any environmental change. Again, nature determines change in the natural world. When the environment changes, it puts pressure on a species. That pressure means that only some of that species will survive. Because those members of the species survived that change, their genetic information is passed on, their traits become more and more prominent in that species. When there's no change in the environment, there's no change in the species because everyone is coping. So, when we talk about natural selection and evolved behaviors, we use this term adaptive a lot. And this is where we need to focus in on, okay? Natural selection produces what we call adaptive behaviors. And that means that the behavior being adaptive, it works well for its environment. It's adaptive to the situation. So the behaviors we're talking about here are behaviors that help us cope or help a species cope with their environment. They're adaptive because they serve a purpose. They help us out. There are three main categories of interest that we want to specifically talk about when it comes to adaptive behaviors. And the reason we want to focus in on these is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, these three categories of behaviors set the groundwork for learning. Reflexes, modal action patterns, and general behavioral traits are the first source of learning that occur. These three categories of behaviors are theorized to have developed through this natural selection process. So essentially, natural selection has allowed us to gain these three categories of behaviors that help us learn to continue coping with our environment. We'll look at what this exactly has to do with learning in the next video, when we'll talk about the building blocks of learning and dive a little bit more in depth into those three types of behaviors.